As the Second World War drew to a close, Allied intelligence officers sat down with captured German generals. In makeshift interrogation rooms, they asked a question that seemed to have one obvious answer: which enemy did you fear most? The answers were not what anyone expected. When German commanders spoke about the Americans, their language was resentful but clear, unpredictable, aggressive, backed by industrial firepower that bordered on the irrational. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself wrote about American forces recovering from the disaster at Kasserine Pass with a speed that truly surprised him. General von Rundstedt called Patton the best commander he faced. By the war's end, the consensus among German officers was clear. The Americans had become genuinely terrifying opponents. But when those same officers spoke about the British, the tone shifted. It grew quieter, and in many ways more revealing. They didn't call them terrifying or unpredictable. They called them professional, methodical, dangerous in a predictable way, but no less dangerous for it. And beneath the measured language, a pattern emerged that historians are still trying to fully explain. In the war's early years, before American industrial power was fully on the battlefield, German commanders in North Africa and Italy didn't lose sleep over fresh-faced soldiers from America. They lost sleep over the men fighting since 1939, the men with regimental traditions stretching back for centuries, the men who, against all odds, just kept coming. To understand why, we must begin not with victory, but with a crushing defeat that taught the British Army something the Germans never expected them to learn. In June of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was thrown off the continent of Europe at Dunkirk. Over 330,000 men were evacuated, but they left nearly all their equipment behind. 84,000 vehicles, 657 aircraft, and enough artillery to equip an entire army. By any military standard, Britain's land force had been annihilated. German generals, watching it all, concluded that the British Army, despite its traditions, was finished as a serious opponent. They were wrong. And more importantly, they were wrong in a specific way that would cost them dearly over the next 4 years. You see, the British Army didn't just rebuild, it rebuilt differently. General Sir Claude Auchinleck, writing from the Western Desert Campaign in 1941, identified a problem the British had to confront after Dunkirk that no other major power had yet faced so brutally. Their entire pre-war doctrine was designed for a type of war that was already extinct. The set-piece battles of the First World War, the slow grind of static fronts, the rigid split between infantry and armor, none of it survived contact with Rommel's fast-moving panzers in the desert. The British had to tear up their rule book and write a new one under fire, fighting veteran German units in some of the most brutal tank combat of the entire war. The early results were disastrous. Operation Battleaxe in June 1941 failed to relieve Tobruk and cost the British 91 tanks and nearly 1,000 men in 3 days. Operation Crusader later that year succeeded, but was a tactical bloodbath, with British armor charging headfirst into German anti-tank screens in an uncoordinated, piecemeal way the Germans had come to expect. General Ludwig Cruel, commanding the Afrika Korps, later noted that British tanks attacked with great courage, but terrible coordination. He did not mean it as praise, but Cruel would be forced to change his mind. They all would. What happened next was not the dramatic top-down revolution Patton imposed on the Americans in 1943. It was slower, grimmer, and because of that, much more permanent. It was the transformation of a 300-year-old institution, which was now, for the first time in its modern history, being forced to question everything it knew about war. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery arrived in the Western Desert in August of 1942 to take command of the Eighth Army. He found a force that was exhausted, confused, and fighting with a broken command structure that gave too much initiative to the wrong people and not enough to the right ones. His solution was, simply put, the exact opposite of Patton's. Where Patton decentralized and demanded improvisation, Montgomery centralized and demanded meticulous preparation. This has led generations of historians to compare the two, as if Montgomery's approach was just a more cautious version of the American way of war. But that view misses what Montgomery truly understood about his army and his enemy. German tactical doctrine, or mission command, worked because it allowed for much faster decision-making than any opponent could match. A German commander facing a surprise on the battlefield didn't wait for orders. He simply acted. And because his superiors had given him a clear objective, instead of a rigid script, his actions supported the wider plan. Against an opponent who also tried to improvise, this created a chaos and friction that consistently favored the Germans. But against an opponent who refused to improvise, who fought from a prepared position, with a plan rehearsed and coordinated in depth, produced something else entirely. Montgomery made the Eighth Army into exactly that kind of opponent. His preparation for the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 took 3 months. He refused to attack until he had overwhelming material superiority and rehearsed every phase of the operation with the units that would execute it. He coordinated his artillery, armor, and infantry into a single system, not just a collection of arms fighting in the same battle. When 882 British guns opened fire at El Alamein on the night of October 23rd, firing 529 rounds each during the opening barrage, the effect wasn't merely physical. It was an announcement that something had changed. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured at El Alamein and brought before Montgomery, reportedly told his captor that the artillery preparation was unlike anything he had encountered on any front. He had expected the usual gaps, the usual opportunities for a local counterattack, but he found none. German officers who fought the British across North Africa, Italy, and eventually Northwest Europe developed a very specific understanding of what made them dangerous, and it was this. The British did not make the same mistake twice. This might sound like a modest quality, but in the context of sustained combat against a tactically superior opponent, it was decisive. The contrast with the Italians, whom many German commanders wrote about with barely hidden contempt in their private diaries, was telling. Italian formations could fight with ferocity in individual battles, but struggled to absorb lessons as an institution and change their methods. The British did the opposite. Their regimental system, which some European officers dismissed as sentimental traditionalism, turned out to be one of the most effective institutional learning machines on the battlefield. Information about what worked and what failed moved sideways through a regiment faster than through formal chains of command because the regiment was also a social institution. Lessons were not just communicated, they were absorbed into the unit's identity. General Fritz Bayerlein, who served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, wrote after the war that the British infantryman was individually inferior to the German in tactical flexibility and small unit initiative, but that this was largely irrelevant because the British system as a whole was more adaptive than German commanders the first understood. Bayerlein described watching British units take a hit in the afternoon and return the very next morning with a modified approach that addressed the exact weakness the Germans had exploited. This happened too consistently to be coincidence. It was, he concluded, a deliberate institutional process. The British Army's system of after-action review, formalized through the Directorate of Military Training's circulation of tactical notes and pamphlets, was less dramatic than the American approach, but no less effective over the course of a campaign. Where the Americans built a rapid feedback loop that could roll out new tactics army-wide in weeks, the British built something more like a slow-burning institutional memory that proved nearly impossible to wear down. This quality of not repeating mistakes had a specific tactical result that German commanders found particularly costly, and it centered on anti-tank warfare. The early desert campaigns had exposed a devastating British weakness. Their infantry, artillery, and armor did not fight as a combined system. German anti-tank screens, positioned to catch British armored charges while panzers hit the flanks, had destroyed hundreds of British tanks in exchange for relatively light losses. By the later North African battles, and certainly by the Italian campaign of 1943 and 1944, this had been thoroughly corrected. British infantry advances in Italy were preceded by what German defenders called the methodical preparation. This was a term used without irony. because its methodical nature was exactly what made it so hard to disrupt. Artillery would suppress known and suspected German positions. Engineers would clear mines under covering fire. The infantry would advance in stages, consolidating each gain before making the next. And unlike the early desert battles, armor would move with the infantry, not ahead of it. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded a Panzer Grenadier regiment in Normandy in 1944, wrote in his memoirs that the British and Canadian attacks in the Caen sector were slow by American standards, but extraordinarily difficult to stop. Every time his regiment found a British weakness and prepared to exploit it with a local counterattack, the British had already consolidated the position they had just taken, laid defensive mines, and positioned their anti-tank guns to meet the exact armored response he was planning. He described the experience as fighting an enemy who seemed to know in advance what you were going to do. And they did. They had learned the hard way in North Africa, and they had not forgotten. There was a final dimension to the British threat that German commanders rarely acknowledged in formal reports, but more openly in their private papers. The British did not break. Now, this requires careful qualification. Individual British units had certainly broken under pressure during the war. Tobruk fell in June 1942, with 33,000 men captured in circumstances that shocked Churchill and appalled Roosevelt. There were failures of leadership, failures of coordination, failures that went to the heart of institutional problems not yet resolved. The British Army in 1942 was, in some ways, the same army that had stumbled out of Dunkirk. But the institution itself, the core of the army, persisted through every disaster, every lost campaign, and every single setback. It faced trials that would have shattered a less historically rooted military, and yet it refused to break. And German commanders, the honest ones anyway, knew it. General Erwin Rommel wrote about the extraordinary stubbornness of British defensive positions in the Western Desert, a quality he admired even as it wrecked his operational plans. He noted that British infantry, once dug in, had to be physically destroyed or outflanked because they would not be driven out by fire alone. They would take casualties that German soldiers would have seen as perfectly good reasons for a tactical withdrawal, but the British would just keep holding. He put this down to discipline, regimental culture, and something else he found harder to define, an institutional belief that their position would eventually be relieved, because in its long history, the British Army didn't abandon its own. Now, he wasn't entirely right about that, but that belief shaped German planning in ways that consistently cost them time and resources, and in a war of attrition, time and resources were exactly what Germany could not afford to lose. So why, by 1944, did German soldiers find the Americans more dangerous? The answer shows us precisely where the British threat was real and where it had its limits. The British system was built around a careful, resource-conscious approach to war, reflecting the hard-won lessons of the First World War and the reality of an empire stretched thin. Montgomery's doctrine of set piece, battles with overwhelming force, wasn't timidity. It was a rational response to Britain, by 1942, fighting at the very edge of its manpower and industrial capacity. There was no margin for the kind of catastrophic losses a failed gamble would create. This meant the British danger was, in a specific sense, predictable. German commanders who had studied, Montgomery knew when he wouldn't attack. They knew he wouldn't move without immense preparation. They knew a well-supplied German defensive line could hold off a British offensive longer than it could an American one, because the British, taught not to waste men, would pause to rethink their plans rather than just absorb losses and press on. The Americans, once they learned how to fight, brought both British adaptability and an industrial surplus that changed the entire equation. They didn't need to conserve. When an American offensive stalled, the response wasn't to pause. It was to bring in more artillery, more planes, more men, until the obstacle simply ceased to exist. The British had learned to be dangerous within their limits. The Americans had learned to remove them. German soldiers who survived the war understood this distinction better than many later commentators ever have. They didn't fear the British less because they were less capable. They feared the Americans more because The Americans had taken what the British built the institutional learning, combined arms, that refusal to break, and added a sheer weight of material that made all old calculations obsolete. But in the long middle years of the war, when the American army was still learning in North Africa, stumbling against German professionalism for the first time, the British were the army that gave Rommel sleepless nights, the army that kept getting back up, the army that made the same mistake exactly once. Organizations that build institutional memory always defeat organizations that rely on individual brilliance alone. Professionalism forged over centuries doesn't vanish under pressure, it adapts. And sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most resources, but the one that has been doing this for a very long time and has finally worked out how to win. The Germans learned that lesson in the Western Desert. They did not enjoy the curriculum,